smelled of wet dirt, horse sweat, and trouble. On June 3rd of 1781, Virginia was sitting in the dark, pretending the war was farther away than it really was. Thomas Jefferson was in Monticello. Members of the Virginia legislature were nearby in Charlottesville. Men with titles and papers and political opinions were sleeping beneath quiet roofs, while the British cavalry pushed through the night, looking to scoop them up before sunrise. Before I continue, I wanted to add in here that my mother used to try to claim that we were descended from Thomas Jefferson. Thanks to modern DNA technologies, it's been proven that this was 100% false. I thought that was just kind of an interesting little aside. Also, if you notice that it seems a little bit brighter in my studio today, it snowed yesterday. I do record these videos in advance, and right now it is May 6th, even though this is being posted and played on June 3rd. So it's the middle of spring right now as you're watching it. Honestly, it's spring right now as I'm recording it, but it's also 34 degrees outside and snowing. So now back to the story. So the strangest part of the story is that the most Americans during this time never, and even afterward, they never hear about the man who actually stopped these events that I'm talking about from actually happening as the British are marching toward Thomas Jefferson. So everybody knows about Paul Revere. School children can practically recite him from memory. Everybody knows the midnight ride of Paul Revere, right? But Jack Jouett rode farther through much rougher country, carrying a warning that may have saved Virginia's government during the American Revolution. And history pretty much answered all of that with complete silence. That silence is what makes this story feel kind of criminal. Jack was not a tiny, nervous fellow sneaking through the dark, whispering warnings to frightened farmers that he saw along the way. He was a massive man. He was 6'4", which is incredibly tall for that era. He was around 220 pounds. He was broad-shouldered and tough. He was the sort of man who probably looked like he'd been carved out of an old fence post and mule harness leather. Honestly, he was very much out of place for the time. He came from a tavern family in Virginia. His father ran the Swan Tavern in Albemarle County. The family supported the Revolution hard enough that one of Jack's brothers actually died in the war. The family was not sitting safely in parlors and talking politics over tea like many, many, many families were. These people had skin in the game. By 1871, the Revolution had turned ugly in the South. Benedict Arnold had already betrayed the Americans and attacked Richmond. British General Charles Cornwallis was marching through Virginia, trying to break what remained of the organized resistance. Then Cornwallis got valuable information. He learned that Thomas Jefferson and Virginia's lawmakers had fled Richmond and gathered near Charlottesville. Well, that was a little too tempting for him to ignore. Catching them would have been basically a massive humiliation for the revolution. Imagine scooping up an entire state government before breakfast even started. So, of course, Cornwallis handed the job to one of the most feared cavalry officers in the British Army at the time. His name was Benestare Tarleton. I'm just going to call him Tarleton. That's easy. Now, Tarleton does deserve a moment of attention because this man had a reputation sharp enough to cut skin. He was young and aggressive and fast-moving and ruthless. Americans hated him with a passion that practically glowed. Stories about him spread through the colonies like sparks through dry grass. And honestly, some of that hatred really was earned. Tarleton, he moved quickly. He attacked hard, and he had very little patience for mercy once a fight had turned hot. To the British, he was effective. To American patriots, he was a nightmare on horseback. You didn't want to mess with this dude. Cornwallis ordered him to ride hard toward Charlottesville with cavalry and mounted infantry. The plan depended on speed and surprise. If Tarleton moved fast enough, Jefferson and the legislature would still be asleep when the British sabers started clattering through the town, and they'd be taken by surprise. And for a while, it looked like this might actually work. Late on the night of June 3rd, Jack was near the Cuckoo Tavern in Louisa County. Some accounts say that he was sleeping outside, but others say that he was nearby at his father's house. But either way, he heard the horses approaching through the darkness, and he knew something was up. And that sound kind of changed history. And it's something that we don't hear about. So Jack Jouett saw British cavalry riding along the main road. He immediately understood what they were doing. He didn't have to hear the plans. Charleston was vulnerable. Jefferson and the legislators had pretty much almost no protection. So Jack was not handed any kind of orders, not like Paul Revere was. Nobody tapped him on the shoulder and said, go save the government. There was no committee meeting. There was no dramatic speech. There was no official mission. There was nothing like that. It was just one man who heard danger coming and decided to act before anyone else even understood what was happening. That's pretty brave. History often turns on individuals making decisions in moments where nobody is watching. But Jack mounted his horse around 10 o'clock that night and took off for Charlottesville. Tarleton had the main road covered, so Jack had to go through the rough backwood trails through the Virginia countryside. Well, this is not a pleasant moonlight trot through some smooth fields. He rode through woods and mud and creek crossings and narrow paths and uneven terrain and did all of this in the darkness for 40 miles. That's 40. And he did this at night, trying to outrun an entire British cavalry. And unlike Paul Revere, who had help from others and a network of riders and signals, Jack was out there all alone. You can almost picture it. There's tree branches slapping against his coat and his face and his hair, and it's just grabbing at him. The hooves are crashing through the dirt paths. There's sweat rolling down the horse's neck. Every minute counts. Every wrong turn is dangerous, and every delay is deadly. Meanwhile, Tarleton pushed forward with cold efficiency. Around midnight, the British paused briefly and then continued moving after having a brief break. Before dawn, they reached plantations near Charlottesville. At Castle Hill, Dr. Thomas Walker supposedly stalled Tarleton with food and drink, just long enough to buy extra time for the fleeing Virginians who had just gotten the word. Whether every detail of that breakfast story is true, well, that hardly matters now. The important part is that the British kept getting delayed by small moments like this, while Jack kept on riding. And then finally, sometime around 4:30 in the morning, Jack, after 40 miles, reached Montecito. Thomas Jefferson was there. Accounts differ on exactly how the meeting happened. Some stories say that Jefferson was already awake in the gardens. Others say that Jack had to wake up the household by banging loudly on the doors and the windows. However it happened, the warning arrived just barely in time. The British cavalry was coming. Jefferson suddenly had a decision to make. Now, this is part of the story that gets funny in a very human way. Jefferson did not exactly leap into immediate panic mode. He sent his family away, and he gathered his papers and made arrangements, and apparently he even paused for breakfast with his legislators before fully leaving. You can almost hear the frustration from anyone standing nearby. "Sir, the British are literally coming up the road right now." Yeah, of course, he gets it. Yes, I understand. But let me organize these documents first. Who is this man? So Jefferson kept checking the road with a telescope while continuing his preparations. Finally, when the British cavalry actually appeared close enough that delay was no longer an option, he packed up and beat feet. At that point, Jefferson mounted his horse and escaped into the woods just before Tarleton's men reached his home. That's how close this whole thing came. It was within minutes, possibly less. The British cavalry rode onto Jefferson's property, and almost immediately after he left, his household slaves, his workers, hurried inside to hide the valuables while the British searched the estate for Jefferson. Had Jack been any slower, Thomas Jefferson may have been captured by the British Army, and he might have been killed. Think about how enormous that would have been, not just symbolically, but politically, psychologically. The revolution was already exhausted by 1781. Capturing Jefferson and Virginia's lawmakers would have been a devastating propaganda victory for the British overall. But Jack, well, he wasn't done yet. After warning Jefferson, he rode another couple of miles into Charlottesville to warn the legislators, staying at the Swan Tavern where they were, which happened to belong to his own father, as I mentioned earlier. And that detail always feels kind of strangely perfect, but history crashing directly into his family's business. Of course, he's going to do something about it. So the lawmakers scattered quickly after hearing the warning. Most of them escaped. A few were captured later on, but the larger disaster had pretty much been avoided because of Jack. And then comes the part that feels almost too strange to invent. General Edward Stevens was also trying to escape. He had been wounded earlier in the war and could not especially move very fast. Jack rode beside him for part of the escape. Now remember something important here. Jack was dressed like a man who wanted every eye in the country pointed at him. Jack had put on a scarlet-colored military coat with fancy plumed hat. He had a very big horse, and he was a very big man. He probably looked like the lead character in somebody else's exaggerated war story. Really did stand out. Stevens, meanwhile, looked shabby and unimpressive. So when the British cavalry spotted them, they assumed that Jack had to be the more important officer of the two. So naturally, they chased the flashy guy, which meant that Stevens escaped because the British picked the better dressed target. That may be one of the greatest accidental decoy moments in the Revolutionary War history. Jack managed to get away because of his horse, and Stevens, with his limp and all, survived. Meanwhile, Tarleton's raid succeeded only partially. He disrupted some things, sure. He captured some lawmakers. He caused some panic. But he failed to seize the major prize. Virginia's leadership survived. And then history did something, well, frustrating. It pretty much forgot the man who was responsible for all of it. Now, to be fair, Virginia did try to honor him at the time. The legislature voted to reward Jack with a pair of pistols and a sword. Well, he got the pistols. The sword became one of those government projects that wandered off into the paperwork and fog and was forgotten forever. Recorded years later and delayed again, and apparently never got delivered, which somehow feels perfectly on brand for politics in general. Thank you for saving the government. Your ceremonial sword is currently being processed. For how many lifetimes now? After the war, Jack moved west into Kentucky. And honestly, his later life feels like 3 different frontier stories stitched together. He became a farmer and then a politician and a livestock breeder and a landowner. And he served multiple terms in government. Jack helped to establish settlements in Kentucky. And then there's an even more bizarre family story about him stopping at a cabin during his travels, trying to rescue a woman from an abusive husband, getting hit over the head with a cooking pot by the same woman he tried to help, and riding for miles with the broken pot stuck around his neck before finding a blacksmith to be able to remove it. Which sounds ridiculous right up until you remember Frontier America was basically one long parade of unbelievable events happening to exhaust people. So Jack eventually married, and he raised a large family and built a respected life in Kentucky. One of his sons became well known for portrait painting, which, well, it disappointed Jack enormously. Reportedly, he grumbled that he sent the boy to school to become a gentleman and instead got nothing but a damn sign painter, which is ironic when you think that there are absolutely zero paintings of Jack himself. Parents have apparently been confused by their children's career choices for centuries. Mine are no exception to that. Yet through all of this, Jack's greatest act remained that single ride through Virginia that one night. And here's what makes the whole story sting just a little bit. The real reason that Paul Revere became immortal was not just because of the ride of itself. It was because of the poetry, the storytelling, the repetition, and the cultural memory. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow himself turned Paul Revere into legend generations later. Not at the time of his ride, but generations later. Jack never got a famous poem. No giant school book myth wrapped itself around his name. No national obsession formed around his ride. So the story slowly drifted into the corners of American history where important people sometimes kind of disappear. But historians know better. Without Jack's warning, the British forces may have captured Thomas Jefferson and much of Virginia's legislature in one simple stroke, in one fateful morning. That's not a small historical footnote. It's a massive. And maybe there's something fitting about the fact the man riding through darkness on unknown and unexplored trails stayed partly hidden by history afterward, too. Still, forgotten doesn't mean unimportant, not even close. Because sometimes the people who quietly change everything are the ones that history talks about the least. So tonight, I want to ask you something. If Jack Jouett had failed that night in 1781, how different do you think the American Revolution might have become? And why do you think some heroes become legends while others almost disappear from public memory entirely? It's sad when it happens. These people deserve to be remembered. Jack did an incredible thing. Sounds like he did more than one incredible thing. Might have been a little bit of a jerk to his kid, but what a man, huh? And if you enjoy stories like this, unusual stories about people you've probably never heard of, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments and people. And subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. You can subscribe in pretty much everywhere you can find a podcast. Every subscriber helps, and you know how I love hearing from you guys. Thank you for watching.